Whether it's a movie night or just midday, Skinny Pop is a salty snack that keeps on giving. Made with just 3 simple ingredients for an irresistibly delicious taste and a large serving size that lasts. Deliciously popped, perfectly salted. Skinny Pop, popular for a reason. Shop Skinny Pop now.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? But with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers, a network of 130 million of them, in fact. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills, and did I say job title? See how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Stouffer's. Here comes 3-time juggling champion Natalia Rogers. She's juggling law school, her TA job. Oh, narrowly catches the laundry. What's that 4th ball? Parents unexpectedly showed up at dinner time? Is that too much for Natalia? Not with Stouffer's Chicken Alfredo and its mouth-watering mix of Asiago, Romano, and Parmesan. When you're juggling 4 things at once and the clock strikes dinner, think Stouffer's.
Welcome to No Question About That. Today we're talking about football, taught by Matt Busby. It's launch week for Wayne Barton's new book. I'm with Wayne now. How's it going?
Yeah, just as I was saying to you just before we started recording, I'm right in the middle of release week anxiety. It's a strange one. Everyone's been very generous so far who has read it. There's nothing quite like that 48 hours before it comes out and just wondering if it's going to take. But yeah.
Cup final nerves. You've done the prep. You've done all the tactical video analysis. You've done your homework. You're ready.
Yeah.
And now you can't brick it the final moment. Are you doing events for launch week?
Well, there might be one planned for Waterstones in Manchester next week, April the 2nd. As of time of recording, it's still going ahead. There's the possibility of family emergency that might undermine it. As it stands, April the 2nd, Waterstones, the details are all online, Waterstones Deansgate. So and I think there's a further one sometime in April with the Scandinavian supporters who've always been great with me. So those 2 events planned, which are
nice. Are you heading out to Stockholm, Oslo?
No, they're coming here.
They're coming here.
Yeah, they do. They travel in numbers, don't they? So I'm not that much of a. I will travel into Manchester City Centre, which I don't need my passport for that. So.
No, you don't. Stockholm, amazing city though. If you like spending €15 on a beer,
I do not.
All right, so let's talk about the book. Then it's pretty hefty.
Yeah,
and it's part a history of Manchester United. It's kind of divided up by managers.
Yeah.
And it's part an exploration of philosophy and identity and DNA and tactics and formations and goals and all of this stuff that goes to make up Manchester United. So let's start at the origins then. Why this book? Your previous books, you mostly focused on one person, a biography, a time period or something like that.
2013, just after Brian Greenough died, I was very, very lucky to interview Harry Craig. And he said something which really stuck with me. He referenced United as the Hollywood of football. I don't know if you remember, if your memory is good with this, but I remember in the 90s, the Bayern were called FC Hollywood.
Yeah.
But I liked the idea of Hollywood of football because I thought that's a really interesting turn of phrase. And it always made me, from that moment on, I was thinking, well, what is United's sort of identity? And Fergie had just retired, and that was the sort of live conversation at the time. And then a year later, Louis van Gaal took over, and everyone was talking about this new, well, the word of the summer was philosophy, wasn't it? Like, never English football. I don't know how that came to be. That was its introduction into English football's lexicon, but it was philosophy with a slight slur, the way that Van Gaal said it. But so for maybe a year or so, that idea was there, trying to formulate into something. And I was never quite sure what it was, but I was writing loads about it. Every time I was interviewing people, I'd be sort of dropping people related to United. I was dropping where I could about, what does United mean to you? Like, what does, if you think about United's style of football historically, what does it represent? What are those core values? All those kind of things fed into conversations. Never really knowing what I was going to do with it, but it became like this big bundle of notes and also manuscripts, but never really tied it in the right way because I wasn't quite sure where and what. Apart from I think when the Van Gaal era was underway, I had an idea that I wanted to write about the identity of the club. I just wasn't sure what form that would take. Then a few years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, might be even 4, maybe even a bit longer than that. I was at lunch with Tony Park, the youth historian, the excellent youth historian who co-wrote Sons of United, which is a Bible for any United fan really wanting to know about the youth history of United. And one of the great researchers in the club's history, it was his research that uncovered the stat about the thousands of games that United have had a youth player in the team, and a really good friend of mine. So we would meet for lunch regularly, and there's just this one time I was having this conversation with him about this idea. And the idea, then I got the formulation for it. Like I wanted to write a book about United's identity, going through all the managers, because I was starting to see a common theme, or even if there wasn't a common theme, I could see the conversation. I could see what I wanted to do with it. And I talked to Tony about it. But my reticence with it was that because if you're going to go there, you have to sort of not ask a question. You have to state with some authority. You have to be able to tell people what it is, what you believe it is, as well at the same time as like giving people an opportunity to make their own minds up with it. But that it was always that moment then that was holding me back from doing it. Like maybe a confidence issue, I don't know. But it was kind of like, I don't know if I have the authority to sort of say this. I don't really feel like I can. And it was literally only that was stopping me from doing it. But Tony was like, well, nothing like this has ever existed. And if not you, who's going to do it? Not like like you're the best person for it, but it doesn't exist. So why would you stop it? That stopped you from doing it. So it got the impetus from that, really kick up the arse to do it. And because I had all the notes and everything sort of came into place quite quickly after that. So it was like over the sort of next 6 months, I had 2 people who would always proofread all my work. The Tom Clare. Anyone listening to this will know the name Tom Clare, and Barry Schmeiser, maybe not as well renowned as Tom, but he was a South African Red who his collection was incredible. He had a connection going back to the 60s and 70s, like he would travel over from South Africa. He knew Busby and Ferguson personally, and they would always read early drafts of my work, and unfortunately both passed away in the last couple of years. But this was the last of my work that they read, and they were both very enthusiastic and about it. So I thought, yeah, all right, I'm all happy with the direction that this is taken, and it's something that I can commit to print, and it looks like a coherent sentence the whole way through. There's the structure there. I know what I'm trying to say. And as soon as I had that kind of wind in my sails, then all of that was pretty easy to put together. So the actual end part of getting it all down was straightforward. But it took very, very long time to get there. Like I said, because once I knew that it was going to go right back to day one, because there's the idea of like the United's ideal philosophy starts with Busby. So you could write a book in and of the Busby era itself and just say that this is what United is. I thought if I'm going to go that far, I might as well just do everything and see how it connects.
Yeah.
And so that's where it was really. And thankfully, there's a couple of years ago, I had the finished draft and I was like bugging my literary agent. There was just a gap in a window for a book to come out. And it was this one. I don't know why. I just had this really strong feeling about it. I know that I feel it's my strongest work. And I had lunch with Tony Whelan, who was the assistant academy director, who was the assistant academy director at United, associated with the club going back decades, first as a player in the 60s, and then as a youth team coach for the last 40 odd years, really. Is nobody knows United's history as well as he does in terms of like from the inside. He's the best person to talk about its identity and culture. And I sent him the final draft of it, and he was very enthusiastic about it, agreed to do a forward for it. And I think because he agreed to do the forward, and at that time I didn't have a publisher, it was just about getting everything in the right place. He was so enthusiastic about it, and I was so then vindicated by the premise of the idea. Right. That's how I pleased to my literary agent, can we find a place for it? And Reach they've designed an incredibly looking, it's stunning cover, just a beautiful book. So yeah, that's the journey of how it got there. A very long time, but I'm delighted.
All right.
and anxious that he's finally here.
Well, we'll see. Big cup final comes on the 27th, so don't choke, Wayne. Get it out there. No, okay. Let's. So it's structured around two tent poles of Busby and Ferguson. Obviously, the former really about the setting the stone for the philosophy, but actually it begins earlier than that with the pre-Busby years, kind of setting the foundation. So, why were the 30s important for the coming of Busby, and what did that mean in terms of the structure of United? Did we already have an identity then, or did it come, because that's 50, 60 years after the club's formation? So why was that period important?
It's funny, isn't it? Because there are like multiple rebirths of United or regenerations. If you look at like the stepping stones to the generations, first of all, you've got the formation, then the rebirth from youth to United. You've got threatened bankruptcy when Gibson comes in, moved to Old Trafford. Before that, Munich, bombing of Old Trafford, all these things, relegation, all these little different rebirths, catalysts. United, in terms of their identity, were formed in many ways before the 30s. So a lot of things that we commonly associate with them nowadays. First of all, the ambition had been there since the founder, Frederick Attock. The club's early days was sort of like he was a well-respected man in the railway industry, and he had connections throughout business, really. And so United had this like elitist board very early on, like politicians and sports writers and everything like that. I think that for some time there was an office, the MEN had an office at the grounds offices for a while. So Attock had established that. Then when Davies took over, he had this like ambition to sort of build this 100,000 capacity stadium, which was Old Trafford, and the club moved there. Coincided with Ernest Magnell becoming manager, and the first Manchester City scandal, which enabled them to acquire all these players. The United already had a really strong title-worthy defence, but then they had a collection of great attackers attached to that.
Important side point there, though, Wayne. Like in the DNA of football clubs, it's cheating. Just who'd have thunk it?
Well, yeah, well, that's your, maybe if you want to take up the City book, although Gary James was a well-renowned historian for City, might fight you for that. But I mean, yeah, good point. And I'm digressing from the question that you asked, but what I'm saying is that United had a strong identity beforehand. Like from that quarter of players who came in from City was Billy Meredith, who everyone remembers is the game's first superstar, and he was that for United. Also, when they won the Cup, and when they won the first league title, there was a thing about they won it through unity. And yeah, you can say that about every great team, but this was particular about this United side, that they worked hard for each other. And they wasn't always the star that took the glory on the big days. For example, the FA Cup in 1909 was won by Sandy Turnbull, who was kind of like the workhorse of the team. So if you can imagine Wayne Rooney scoring the winning goal in the Club Cup when we've got Ronaldo was the best player in the world, that kind of dynamic. So those kind of things, colloquial and contrived as they may be, they were still there, present in United's identity. The 30s are important because United were destitute. They were about to go bankrupt. They couldn't afford to pay any of the players. So they were exercising the contacts that they got in the Manchester community. Louis Rocker, who was well-resourced in the Manchester Catholic community, put the feelers out through the sort of business industry. And this guy who wasn't really into sports, but he liked his rugby, but he was a man in, I think he had a fashion line where he was working in providing uniforms and things like that for soldiers and for bus conductors. I think that's what I was told by the family. The family, they didn't have bus conductors didn't have uniforms in those days, so he came up with the bright idea to make them. So it was a profitable line for him, and he was making a lot of money. But he wanted to get into something different, and they offered him this route of saving a football club, which was appealing to his ego. United were financially really, really struggling; couldn't afford to pay the players. The players had kind of agreed to defer the pay for a little bit. Gibson came in and said he was impressed by the spirit there, and sort of said, I'll pay you all after Christmas, and he bought them all a turkey, you know what I mean? Like the show of wealth, that kind of thing. So when he had time to look at the clubs.
Can you imagine that today? Bruno, we can't pay you, but here's the turkey.
Yeah, for Christmas. Yeah.
M&S voucher.
I reckon Bruno would go for that. Maybe not one or two others, but Bruno, you can see having the sort of togetherness to go for that. But so Gibson came in and he was like a great pioneer all of himself. I know they had Crickmer, Rocker already at the club in terms of strong employees who had been there a long time already, but they were the two dominant figureheads at United. But Gibson came in and he had plans like he wanted. He wanted to improve the traffic infrastructure around the ground so that supporters
didn't work then.
No, but he appealed to the supporters groups. He was offering season tickets and stuff like large advance payments and things like that from the supporters to sort of get behind the team, to sort of give their pledge. So he was doing all these things to sort of connect with and also pledging transfer funds. But the idea was that I'll do this in the short term, but we can't. If United aren't turning a profit, we need to be able to create something that enables us to turn a profit. And that's where the genesis of the youth system came, with Crickmer and Rocker. And then they eventually hired Scott Duncan, who was a manager from Scotland who had good contacts, but he also believed in bringing youth through us. Gibson had said something like a Manchester team made of Manchester lads. So you could see what the idea was. Very early in the early 30s, this was going on. So they got all these teams, the local recruits, they were given trials, they were signed up and everything like that. And so in the very early 30s, they were constructing the second and reserve sides that were basically filled with local lads. The first couple came through in the very early 30s. One of the first two, I think he was the second one, was Tom Manley. And he is significant because I think it was 34 on the last games of the season. We went down to Millwall, threatened with relegation to Division 3. That's how dire things were for United. And Manley scored, and United stayed up. And from there, they were stable. They were stable enough that they would flirt with relegation and promotion to Division 1 and back down, but never to Division 3 and in the kind of trouble that they were in. Because if they'd gone down to Division 3, we're talking about a very different near-term future for United after that.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing was obviously very important to stabilise the club. But then the war came along. Scott Duncan left for Ipswich. The framework of what he left was already in place. Gibson had sort of backed off with the high fees for players. He kind of, at that point in when the war came around, it was like, well, I've already invested a lot in the players. We now want to see the rewards of the youth system. So this is before Busby came in charge, and you've got Walter Crickmer, who's the manager, obviously the war team at the time, but also de facto working with the youth team. I think it was the Goslings, the brothers who were local amateur side, who sort of agreed to take on some of the young players so they could keep competitive during the war. And during this time, United recruited loads of players who would eventually become renowned for being in Busby's first grade side, which were the likes of Johnny Carey, Charlie Mitten. Carey was an inside forward, one of the great players of his day, but he was retrained to play further back. The idea being that your defensive players were the players who usually weren't good with the ball, but if you retrain the forward players to play in there, if they had the willingness to do that, then you could have a team that was more well-rounded and could attack from all different sides, that was the work of Crickmer, really. It was something that Busby inherited and got a lot of praise for because it was part of Busby's philosophy as well. But you're asking what was there, what Busby inherited. So all of these things were the majority of the 1948 side, which won the FA Cup under Busby's first trophy, and the majority of the side that won the first league title under him in 1952 were already there when he took over.
Well, it kind of leads to the question, like, how much of a philosophy did Busby bring in versus was already there? Did the club try to recruit him for his philosophy? What we come to understand of Busby sides and Busby football and the identity of the club. Like, how much did he bring with him to help construct?
Well, he believed in entertaining the supporters, and I think that's something that they wanted there anyway. Remember, he was 36 when he was given the job, and he demanded full control, which was an unheard of thing, especially for like any manager. But for a manager who was that young, we were coming out of an era of secretaries and boards and committees selecting sides, and boards deciding, chairmen in particular, singular figures who ran their local clubs. They were the ones who were saying, this is what went with the football club. So Busby was asking for a lot of control within that. But he did have, it wasn't really like there was a structure of this is how my footballing philosophy is going to be. When they're having that conversation, it was more a line of he was demanding full control. They had to talk about general ideas like we've got a young team here. The stadium is just being bombed. You're not going to have a lot of money in the near future. Can you make do with that? And I think Busby's kind of trade-off for that was I can deal with those constraints as long as you give me full control over that. Now, the master plan was like, recruiting younger players and everything like that. But even that wasn't something that was immediate. So Busby's first idea was like, wait, in the time where he'd spent out of football, where he'd been a Liverpool player, and he was thinking about going into coaching, I think most of his coaching ideas were formed during the war, where he was spent going around with different soldiers, because he was a decommissioned soldier going around playing these football matches that were raising morale for different soldiers. And Busby was part of a coup that had Brazilian footballers in it, and he would watch these Brazilian footballers play with liberation. Like, it's very, very weird to explain this because it sounds so backwards. The 1930s and 40s British football and world football really was very stoic and very structured within that formation. So it was listed as a 2-3-5. It was a 3-2-5. And the middle player of the three would drop into defence. So it was a 3-man defence, 2 midfielders and 5 attackers. And they would line up 1 to 11. And your opponents knew they would also line up 1 to 11. And that was football for the first 50 years, apart from the odd formation changes. But then around 1909, 10, that was the kind of structure that it'd been for 30 odd years. Change of the offside rule and Herbert Chapman at Arsenal, they introduced some tactical revolutions in there. Busby wasn't really that kind of a man, but what he had seen in the war was these Brazilian footballers who moved around. And that was something that was a little bit different because that's skill, obviously, but as was seen in the 1953 game with possibly the greatest, most influential game in football history, which was Hungary going to England and winning 6-3. What had happened there, which was already it impressed Busby with these Brazilians, is that the Hungarians would drop out of position, and that's how they would fool the English players. So at the time, the British press thought that was unsportsmanlike. It sounds so rudimentary.
This episode is brought to you in association with NordVPN. For those of you who don't know, VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. It secures your connection, protecting your personal information and online activity, especially on public Wi-Fi. The VPN enables your phone or laptop to switch its virtual location to another country, which is great for accessing your favorite content while you're traveling. Long-time listeners will know that I've spent a good part of the last 20 years on a plane. I've recorded this podcast in places from Tokyo to Old Trafford, New York to the Northern Quarter, and a VPN has been absolutely essential to watching the game while I'm abroad. True story. I once racked up a £1,500 phone bill watching a United game while I was in Shanghai. I was on my work phone and I blamed it on video calls back to the office. The key lesson of this story is not how to scam your employee out of a large phone bill, but that I couldn't have watched the United game without a VPN. It's been a real lifesaver. If you want to try NordVPN for yourself, go to nordvpn.com/NQAT, and our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. It's the best discount available and equivalent to the price of coffee per month. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and the link is also in the podcast show notes if you need it. Well, no, it sounds right, Little England. Like, we don't like this fancy Dan tiki-taka, tippy-tappy nonsense, which was kind of the mental revolution, wasn't it? It was like, hang on a minute, you can change tactics. This is almost the genesis of total football.
Well, it was. This is what it was. That's what the Hungarian approach was. But the important point to note out with this podcast and the book, and the reference to this with the Busby era, is that United were already doing that. Yeah, all right, the Hungarians introduced it on a global scale with how they demolished England. But with noting what the Brazilians were doing and getting his players to play like that, but I mean, it's not just the Hungarian kind of roots that were there. There were different things that Busby was bringing in. So because of Krikma's capable training of all these players, it left Busby with this incredibly adaptable squad. So the 3-man midfield, or the 2-man midfield and the 1 defender, where the 1 defender would drop back in, the defensive midfielders would become fullbacks in themselves sometimes, because the fullbacks, Carey and Aston, were converted inside forwards, so they would run forward with the ball. So you had a very, very dynamic system that Busby had got in his hands and he was working with. Added to that, Jimmy Murphy had spent a lot of his time in the 30s in France as a soldier, and he'd seen Jimmy Hogan, who was one of the great revolutionary coaches, working with the Austrian side. Hogan had also gone on to coach the Hungarians, and the Hungarian president, after that 6-3 game, said, "We learned everything that we know from Jimmy Hogan." Now, sometime after that, 1955, I think City played United reserves. The first team had played, and then the reserve team played. And it's just before the turn of the year. And Dom Reve, who had been singularly credited with bringing the Hungarian philosophy into football, he was a forward, and he sort of decided, I'm going to start dropping back and playing like the Hungarians do. So they called it the Revy plan, because no one else in England was playing this way, apparently. But then Revy actually came on. I could not believe that this was a statement that never got the kind of widespread credit. It should have done a widespread placement, because it says so much. He said, I saw United's reserve team playing with the premise that I thought was the sole property of the Hungarians. So he was acknowledging that it was already happening at Old Trafford with the reserve side. So that's a direct link from Murphy watching him. And Murphy had gone on record as well, saying that he was taking Hogan's philosophies into what he thought. So you had Busby's expression of his liberation of football, which was like play to entertain and play with freedom at the senior level. And then when you had that allied with Murphy trying to drill that in from the youth team level, and also the sort of synergy that comes from 4 or 5 years of those players working together. So the players were getting introduced into the first team. The Busby babes were 19, 20 when they were coming in mostly. I mean, you had the exception like Edwards, who was very young. But what you were seeing then when they got into the first team was the result of 4 or 5 years together. Now, you never saw that at senior level in English football. You would see teams get a cycle of 4 or 5 years together and they'd be great sides, but that would happen in their late 20s. So why United were on the precipice of this long period of domination was because they broke in much, much earlier, like 18, 19, 20, and they already had 3 or 4 years of experience playing together and in this kind of style.
Yeah.
So that's why Busby's, that first 10 years in charge was so revolutionary for British football.
Mm. All right, so we come to 58. That youthful side is destroyed in the crash. Like, how does that shape Busby's philosophy? Because the next 10 years are sort of, it's rising from the flames, obviously, and leading to the promised land of the European Cup final in 68. But it's a different side. I mean, there is youth in there.
Yeah.
But there are also transplants as well. So, like, how did 58 change Busby's thinking around what he wanted to bring, if at all, and what was building on the philosophy of the past?
Well, that's one of the most interesting periods for me in United history. In fact, it's inspired another book completely. But this period is so interesting because it did force Busby to address that. The knowledge that, again, the landscape of football being very different. So being the European Cup, you had to win the first division. To win the first division, you had to have a very, very, very good team. And United obviously didn't have a team capable of winning the first division from the ashes of Munich. They had a very good team capable of getting to an FA Cup final and capable of things above their station because of the spirit that they had with the togetherness and the thing that they were fighting for. But the players who came in, who all had high ceilings, were just unable to they liked a developmental stage, which obviously came at a huge cost. Busby had to have the foresight of knowing that was going to happen, try and keep the team competitive in the meantime, but also try and have a long-term project to know that the eventuality of building that side, that they would be built to last. So the short term, actually a lot of money was spent on players who wouldn't be there at the sort of turn of the European Cup. By the time we get there, a lot of these players weren't there. Maurice Setters came in, Noel Cantwell came in, Albert Quicksall was a record buy when he came in. Busby had known to expedite the club's short-term needs, they would have to spend big in order to do that. It was funded largely by those players who came in after the crash and had excelled in order to buy a replacement for Tommy Taylor. He wanted David Hurd. Now, how to generate the funds to get David Hurd was to sacrifice Alex Dawson, who'd been an incredible striker after the crash. He'd done incredible things. His projected potential would have been much higher, but the needs must in that short period of time. So it was like sell him for 20,000 and buy Hurd for 40,000. Sell other wingers who had done quite well and bring in other players, like bring in that hard-nosed backline, bringing in the experience that they'd lost. United had lost the midfield, Coleman and Edwards, and they'd lost inside forwards in Whelan. All their width had gone, not just in Pegg and Berry, who was injured in the crash, but also in Morgans and Scanlon, who came in, and they were the players who were actually the first team at the time of Munich. They'd replaced Pegg and Berry, but the pressure on them after the crash was just too great. So they weren't around by the time of the 63 Cup final. What I think Busby had accepted that he'd have to sort of sacrifice the balance a little bit. I think the idea was the goal was to have 11 youth team players. He knew that wasn't realistic because, he signed Harry Gregg after all and signed Tommy Taylor. He knew that there was a necessity to make sure that those young players had the right sort of foil in the side in terms of Harry Gregg was a world-class goalkeeper who changed the way that they play. So they had to, Busby had to sort of address that and say, the balance has got to be a bit different. We've got to be a bit harder to be. We're going to replace that experience. So it made United for a bit more of a dirty and physical side going into turn of the decade. And then they signed Creran and they signed Lowe, who could both handle themselves as well. And by the time, United were going back to winning things, they were actually seen as a bit of a rough house side, which was kind of funny considering the way that they'd been portrayed as angels before, even though that wasn't necessarily true. I think it's more about the balance with Busby, that he'd sort of said, all right, I will have to make it maybe 50-50 about brought in players and built players, but the idea was always Murphy had promised him another Youth Cup winning side, maybe out of some kind of emotional thing, like, don't worry, we can get back to where we were. But the idea was build a great side, and then feed the youngsters back into it again. And that's what, they were able to do that in the space of 6 years. It's incredible because, one thing is finding talent and developing it, but to have the requisite talent, do you know what I mean? It's not very easy to find that. So,
the 68 side has famously, obviously, Best and Kidd, both 18 and
21, I think. Best
21 with Best, So there's some of that continuation on into the 68 Cup win. I guess, I don't want to gloss over the Busby era especially because it's called Football Talk by Matt Busby, and the book is structured around this as the defining identity, or like everything you can pull out: attacking football, entertainment, youth, success, courage, like all the things you identify at the end of the book that are kind of philosophical tent poles.
Yeah,
they kind of originate here.
Yeah,
but there is this kind of sense of build up to Busby, and then the collapse, and it's almost a series of. I mean, you can feel it repeating, right? There's you talk about the failed philosophies of the managers who came post Busby to Ferguson, and in different ways. Like there's action and reaction. There's Sexton to Atkinson, two completely different managers and philosophies, and so you kind of map those. But in a sense, the failures are often a failure of identity as well, especially with Sexton.
Yeah, I think those ones are very interesting. Obviously, I've covered those periods as well in other books, so I always find them interesting. To write it from the perspective that it would go in this book was interesting, that you have to be more fair to a football manager's philosophy, because you can't just like say that, well, the results say that it doesn't work out. Every manager wants to win, right? So to win, they've got to have some kind of style that wants to impose itself on the opposition. And every manager, apart from maybe two that we can think of, one in particular, in United history, would probably want to win playing attractive football. That's the prerequisite, that they want to do that. And it wasn't that Sexton didn't want to do that. His QPR side, the Chelsea sides, have been very, very interesting, entertaining teams of football. So, and he was renowned as a great coach of young players. Theoretically, everything was in place for him to be the right man to succeed Doherty if someone had to. The problem was that, like when you have a car and the car has got all its faults, but you know how to drive it, and it doesn't really matter that it's knackered or blah, blah, blah. Any kind of issue, it's your car, and you know, like you have to bump it a certain way in order for it to run smoothly. But it's kind of like Doherty's side. They were beautiful to watch, and the energy would leave you breathless. But they were so indoctrinated in Doherty's philosophy. Like even Sammy McIlroy, who was a legend of United, said it shouldn't have worked, referring to Doherty's philosophy, because it was too attacking. There was no concentration on opponents, or little concentration, a little bit more than what Doherty would be given credit for. He was smarter than that, in the same way that Atkinson was. But yeah, the principle remains, whereas Sexton was more thoughtful and cautious. Now the funny thing is, you mention him, and also Van Gaal later on as a more obvious person in this lineage, but Sexton was a big believer in total football. Obviously it was a fad in the 70s. It was introduced very, very, this is the point I make in the book as well. Like, total football isn't what you think it wasn't at the time what it looks like today. You watch the 70s Netherlands side, they are hunting in packs for the ball. It looks like a playground, but it worked at the time, and that's kind of what Doherty's United were like. What Sexton wanted was a little bit of structure to it. You wanted organisation, they wanted instruction, but United had a lot of players who were a cavalier. They didn't play on instruction. They played on instinct. And it shouldn't have worked under Doherty, but it did work, and it worked in that kind of philosophical way that it was more smart than it looked. Whereas when Sexton tried with the instruction, it just oil and water as far as this side was concerned. So the idea was, unfortunately, lose the instinct from that side, which was Gordon Hill was the main casualty, and then Brian Greenough, who was an attacking defender. He brought like a sweeper. United played with two sweepers, so two Ferdinands, if you can imagine that. Buchan and Greenough both brought the ball out. Again, shouldn't have worked, but it was working. Whereas Sexton wanted a bit more order. And he was a big believer in total football and the Hungarians. He had Gordon Hill in watching videos of Hungarian wingers, which shouldn't be a bad thing, but we know the story about videos and players, don't we? David Moyes tried that. For some reason, just doesn't work at United. You've got to encourage your player to be more confident to do it their own way. And so the idea was right, much as it was with Van Gaal. You could say that his own ideology of football is absolutely fine. This is why, people who've listened to me on this podcast for the last few years where I've talked about tenor, when I've said I want to see a little bit more, we'll know now where I was coming from with that, is that you've got to see whether or not it's instruction or instinct, and that's where Sexton fell down.
But history, remember, of course, history distills things into like bite-sized pieces, and you definitely haven't done that here in this book. There's a lot of detail. But history will remember Doherty and Atkinson in a very different way than they'll remember Sexton and Mourinho.
Well,
and is that to do with the ties to what we think of as United's identity? Like, are we like romantics, and the winning the FA Cup in 77 and just losing out in 79 is more important than anything that Sexton achieved? Well, obviously it is, because he didn't achieve much. But does that mean more because it's in a certain style and an identity that somehow we can instinctively grab hold of and go, this is the thing we want?
Well, from a non-romantic point of view, from a purely football, like, this is the philosophy, and this is the...
Romance, by the way, is right throughout your introduction to the book. And I was thinking poor Wayne's wife, she's wanting flowers and chocolates and a nice dinner on Valentine's Day. And what does Wayne bring her? Hey, you've got to look at this Hungarian second division side from 1951. I've cracked it. That's the philosophy.
My wife and my best mate have banned me from saying the words Jimmy Hogan ever again. For the last 5 years, that's all they've heard. But no, so going back, Jimmy Hogan was the man who had inspired Doherty and Atkinson's philosophy of football. He taught them both at youth team level and left such an impression on them that that's the way that they wanted their team to play football. So there's a straightforward, easy explanation for why those two teams were so attacking and so vibrant and so well fondly remembered. And they're the last ties, really, to Jimmy Hogan. So you've got Jimmy Murphy and Busby, and then you've got Doherty and Atkinson. So there's no coincidence there. That's purely that you can tell that that's the Hungarian philosophy. And it's deeply embedded within United's roots. So if you have a coach who follows that, then you've got a really good idea of someone who understands how they can connect with the other elements of United philosophy, which you can't be disregarded. But the point you make about Sexton is such an interesting one with the 79 collapse, because there are two really standout performances in the Sexton era, right? The first one is we lose 4-0 to Porto, and then the second leg, one of the great Old Trafford nights where we're chasing the comeback. We win 5-2. Old Trafford, for some period of time, they're expecting them to win and go through from a 4-0 deficit in the first leg. And the second one, like you said, is the 79 Cup final, the 2-0 down with 10 minutes to go. And then they come back and draw 2-2. But then with a minute to go, they concede that goal. And both of those moments really are inspired by United reverting to what they did under Sexton and under Doherty. They sort of definitely in the case of the Porto game, they went out and just played the way, because they couldn't play with any kind of restraint. They had to play that Doherty way and go out there. And I think the kind of liberation that came from that inspired this great performance. Whereas, United, Sexton had to tell them to go for it. So he had to sort of pull the apron strings off and say, you've got to attack. Ironically enough, the thing that kills that game is that they were going to send Brian Green off to 2-2 to calm it down, because of the flow of the game had gone so frantic. Yeah. And Sexton said, no, just wait a minute and see how it pans out. He was too cautious to make a cautious sub, but he was too cautious in the moment. He was like, no, just wait. And he waited, and we lost.
Too late.
Yeah, so it's interesting to sort of see that the more entertaining we were under Sexton were probably remnants of the Doherty era.
All right, and we come to Ferguson, and it's not immediate that he's identified the philosophy, the identity of United.
No.
He very nearly didn't make it out of those first 2 or 3 years, of course. Although, maybe you'll have some idea from your time with Martin Edwards about how close that was or not. But he's the other tentpole in this story, really, isn't he? He's the you kind of present him as a continuation figure of the Busby philosophy in some fashion.
world moves fast. Your workday, even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
You walk in tired and hungry, one bad dinner away from losing it. You don't like to cook. You don't want more takeout. You just want something good. That's why there's Dish by Blue Apron. Pre-made meals with at least 20 grams of protein and no artificial flavors or colors. From fridge to fork in 5 minutes or less. Keep the flavor. Ditch the subscription. Get 20% off your first 2 orders with code APRON20. Terms and conditions apply. Visit blueapron.com/terms for more.
Busby himself wasn't like a disciple of Jimmy Hogan. So I think that's important to make the distinction out, giving him a lot of credit and importance with the underlying figures at Old Trafford. But the dominant ones, which are Busby and Ferguson, neither of those were directly influenced by Hogan. However, having said that, obviously Ferguson had a great relationship with Steen, and Steen was somewhat influenced by Hogan, who'd been at Celtic. Their kind of influence was more to do with the way that I think Steen believed in youth. He believed in being a people person. But those were things that, they were concurrent with what United had with Busby anyway. So they were there. They were present things. They were just coincidental. And Ferguson had reared youth in the previous clubs they'd been at, St Mirren, notably done that. They made a very young player a captain. Tried to do it with Aberdeen as well. So those kind of things were there. But I think the idea of attaching that to something that was quintessential United, those things were more accidental, really, because we all remember, obviously, the early struggles. He was trying to bring in players. So he was trying to do in the short term. And he knew that the youth system didn't have a lot in it. So he was regenerating that from a scouting perspective. So that was going to take his time. The players who were already there, we didn't think were quite good enough. Those players only came in the peripheral or when United had a crisis, such as early 1989. We played Liverpool at home. I'm sure everyone of a certain age can remember this, when Russell Beardsmore played and scored, and the atmosphere for the first time under Ferguson was absolutely electric. And I think maybe something came, like the penny dropped there, that there was something that was more resonant, because the fans were getting restless. All 3 fanzines were born in that period out of discontent because of what they were seeing. And they were all born in the Ferguson era, by the way, in this period of time. It was like a time of protest, a time of unrest, a time of supporters wanting their voices to be heard because they didn't like what they were seeing. And Ferguson was the driver of that vehicle at the time. So I think that Liverpool game was a major catalyst for him, because a few games after that we played QPR in the Cup. We had this massive injury crisis, and there was young players. Lee Sharp, who'd been brought in, was given a chance. Giuliano Mariorana came in, Tony Gill, David Wilson, Daniel Graham. A bunch of these kids came in for these QPR Cup ties, and they kept us going. Now, we didn't win anything. We got knocked out in the Cup by Forest that season, but it was a massive moment where they were called the Fergie Fledglings, and it was like Fergie believes in youth. And the connection that came from the support was so vibrant, so strong, that I think Ferguson probably began to realise at that moment in time, this is a powerful tool at this club. It's actually more powerful for me to use as something than perhaps giving Mal Donaghy another chance or something. You know what I mean? Give a chance to a kid. The crowd will lose a bit of that lethargy, and they'll form a bit of a stronger connection
very much,
at a time when we need it. I think that's, all right. They still had another year or so until the penny dropped and we started winning. And Martin Edwards, like I said, there's very much the theme of like, how close was he to getting the sack at Forest? Well, Edwards always says no, but he also does add, what if we hadn't won the Cup, or if we hadn't won the European Cup Winners' Cup? That next 2 years wasn't set in stone. He had to keep progressing and doing that with the acknowledgement of these elements of United's identity, which he started to pick up.
Well, the fledglings, none of them really made it. I mean, I guess Sharp maybe had the most prominent career out of all of those. He was a transplant groin from Torquay United.
Yeah.
So didn't grow up at the club as such, but one of these younger signings. But yeah, Mariana ended up not making it in non-league football, or he spent years in the reserves. There's a whole story about his injuries and the trouble he had there. Russell Beersmore didn't quite make it at United, and a few of the others, but there was a sort of genesis of Ferguson going, yeah, okay, I can throw some kids in here and see what happens.
Well, also, like, you mentioned those names there, but two that we haven't mentioned, Mark Robins and Lee Martin. Mark Robins scores a goal at Forest that keeps him in his job, theoretically, and Lee Martin scores a goal that wins the FA Cup. So,
didn't have much of a career outside of that, did Lee Martin, but that will be his defining moment, that FA Cup final 1990 replay winner.
Yeah.
Neil Webb, Lee Martin, fine goal all round.
Yeah, and I think, like, if you think about that Martin scoring, it was 2016, Jesse Lingard, until the next time a youth product scored a winning goal in a cup final for United, which, I mean, it almost sounds like I'm saying that Fergie didn't have astronomical success in the meantime. I'm not saying that. It goes to show how rare it is. Yeah, all right. I mean, there's this element of United have never replicated that. The two youth teams that they had was such a freak of nature. But I think if you look through all their successes, particularly post-Busby, the fact that more or less all of them have had such a strong core of youth. Doherty in 77, there was Greenough and Sammy McIlroy. Ron Atkinson wins the cup with Norman Whiteside scoring a great goal. Louis van Gaal with Jesse Lingard. Just last year, we win the FA Cup with Garnacho and Manu scoring. So it's a thread that runs deep. And if you say stick to beat United with that it hasn't, they never quite had a 92 or Busby Babes again, then the answer to that is that those two are the best of all time. And it's not a freak of nature, but they had, the Busby Babes possibly had 25 plus players. Think about that, 25 plus players, and it wasn't going to stop with the developmental conveyor belt going the way that it was. And the 92 probably had 8 or 9 who had good football careers and 5 or 6 who made it United.
I think it'd be very hard for any team to do that. I mean, obviously we all look at Barcelona and how their ability to keep producing players is saving their bacon at the moment. Yeah. I mean, it helped produce the brilliant sides under Pep, sort of 5 or 6 players coming through from La Masia there, and now they keep churning out players to save them from having to buy anyone they can't afford. So there's that, and obviously over the years Ajax have produced brilliant sides, both in the 70s and the early 90s, especially that early 90s side, then like all disappeared to Milan and formed the core of the brilliant Milan side that followed them. But yeah, it's like just historically very difficult to bring through clutches of players like that.
Yeah.
And nowadays, of course, it's hyper competitive because every club on the planet, or at least all the elite clubs, have scouts everywhere. They have data everywhere. They're looking at footballers from the age of 12 and up and tracking them. And so when Real Madrid buys a player who's 16 years old for 90 million euros or whatever, half of which goes to his dad, then you know what's going on there. So I just think it's almost impossible to kind of replicate that now. Just it's so hyper competitive, so youth players, and yet it formed the not the core of Ferguson's first great side. Like the 94 side was not really formed from youth players.
No,
and most of them were brought in, but after that, it very much is like for the next sort of almost 10 years after that, dominated by that clutch of players that he brings through from the youth team, makes a conscious decision to discard older players to do that. Right?
Yeah.
A brave and a conscious decision, not by accident at all.
The ironic thing is that the team that you spoke of there, the 94 side, is probably my favourite, and they had Giggs and Hughes from the academy, and Hughes had been away and come back. But apart from that, like I said, they're all players who'd be bought in. So what does that tell you? It tells you that you can be in love with something romantic, but it's not necessarily fully attached to the ideal philosophy of the club. But yeah, you're quite right. The Fergie was following the Busby blueprint of, and not intentionally. It wasn't like, oh, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do what Busby did now. The elements of lined up for that in terms of getting control of the dressing room, through letting Ince go, through a player who was a bit discontent and wanted a guaranteed football in Mark Hughes, who went because Andy Cole had signed, and then this completely bizarre chain of events that happened with Andrei Kanchelskis, where they were disputing a hernia injury, and then there was a bung that was presented to Ferguson, all these things, and so he was inevitable.
What happened with that stack of cash then in the locker that just happened to find its way into Ferguson's possession?
Incredible, that one. But you knew that wasn't the plan, because the money that was brought in from those players, United were redeveloping the North Stand. That's when at Martin Edwards was at its greatest, because there wasn't money being reinvested. There was a promise that whatever was brought in could be reinvested. Ferguson was quite happy to keep it as it was with regards to Hughes and Ince, because he had Butt and Keane coming in the middle. He thought McClare could easily moonlight in the middle, and he was right. He thought Cole and Cantona would be players to be his front line, and he was right. And Scholes could drop in there as well. The Kanchelskis one, not so straightforward, because he didn't believe in Beckham as a right-sided midfielder. I didn't really believe in him as a strong centre midfielder at the time. I think Scholes and Butt would have been in front of him. Scholes maybe not, because he was still moonlighting as that number 10, wasn't he? That sort of player. But so United were in for Darren Anderton. They really wanted to sign him. It's just got really nothing to do with the book. It's just a story that I'm aware of. And Alan Sugar he got wind of it, and Anderton had got wind of it after Sugar had made him sign a new contract, which eliminated the clause in that he had a something like £4 million release fee, and by the time that he signed a new contract, it was something like £8 million, and he wanted to go to United, and he couldn't, because his contract had just been signed. There was some kind of stipulation there that he couldn't go straight away as well. So he'd kind of stitched him up with that. And United, Ferguson was sort of kicking his heels a bit, because if he'd been able to get him for 4, he would have got him. But he wasn't going to go for 8 when he had Beckham there. So that's when the decision came to go there. But I mean, Busby being savage.
Sliding doors moment there.
Exactly, yeah. Well, we also signed Poborski a year later, didn't we? So,
well, yeah, that's true. I mean, there's 2 times Darren Anderton has got one over David Beckham, almost getting into the Fergie side, almost. And then, of course, Glenn Hoddle in the 1998 World Cup starts with Anderton ahead of Beckham.
Yeah, exactly. And he was a good player, Anderton, but he wasn't obviously David Beckham. Look, the design of Ferguson doing that in the 90s, he was definitely brave enough to do it, because that side was so colossal in terms of personality, the 94 side, that to break it up before it was over the hill, and that was definitely before it was over the hill, because there was a lot to come from that side. Yeah. To break it up was a lot. It showed a lot of bravery.
Bravery is a Ferguson trait. Bravery in games, bravery with his decision making, and he makes a decision and sticks with it. And I guess the time for me of being most frustrated with Ferguson during his glorious years, and there can't be too many times, was when he wasn't brave. He took the more cautious approach, and it didn't work out. And you're like, why do you do that? You went away from your philosophy.
Yeah.
What has gone on post Fergie then? I mean, obviously, I don't want to relitigate the whole buying the wrong players and the whole commercialization of the club and the Glazers and the debt, and we know all that story. But if we're talking about this book, which is about footballing identity, it seems to have departed so far from Ferguson post him and the managers we've picked, and somehow we convinced ourselves for a little while that, oh yes, this guy's got it. This guy understands it, and none of them do.
Yeah. I think there's a big part of what happened post-Ferguson was the timing of what was going to happen with Mourinho, because like it or hate it, and the book will tell you, will sort of reveal where I fall down on this, United were inevitably going to hire Mourinho at some point in the post-Ferguson era. It was a matter of when they did it. And they come to see him as a personality rather than who he was, the stock that he had at the time. And the people who were running, both the managers, it was Ed Woodward for the longest time, his ideal on what United should be in the modern era impacted everything massively, because I think for that period of time, it was not deemed necessary that United had to reset. It was more to do with spending the capital that they had available to maintain the position. And I think that maybe there was a 6 or 7 year period where they were locked within that frame of mind and they could never pull away from it. And that period of time did include the Mourinho era. And so ironically, you do get like 5.5 years into that by the time that Ollie comes in as a caretaker, and they'd sort of decided 6 months is a reset. And that's the first time that they'd sort of written off a period of time and sort of said, we're going to do that. And I think to bring in someone without any expectation, who it was definitely important that Solskjaer brought in feeling that they both had strong ties to what the club represented. For Solskjaer, there's a lot of similarities with him and Wolf McGuinness in a lot of ways, because everyone was talking about, can he always the bridesmaid, never the bride? We always were getting to semi-finals, but we weren't getting to finals. And it was like everyone was saying this lack of experience as a manager was being held against him. But the issue was, on the positive side, is that United were more closely resembling something that they were. Do you know what I mean? They were historically known for. So we were all connecting from that side of it, but we all had those reservations that we spoke about many times that, you know, they didn't have the experience for it. So he had this like really double-edged sword of like, well, someone who played for United, gets United, can sort of make it feel like United, apart from that critical step of taking that leap.
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, like in the big picture of the post-Ferguson wilderness years, sure, he didn't win a trophy, Ollie, but he got as close to bringing back a good football team as anyone.
Exactly, yeah.
Second and third, and good football and entertainment, and we'll always remember the winning streak after he came in, and lockdown football, some of the best football that United have played in these past 10 years or so.
Yeah.
So
also the Ollie thing has been hampered by it's not all that, because like I'm saying, his inexperience did cost him in critical moments, but we cannot discount the cost of the ownership and the debt that was left. That's when it first crunched us, really, was that summer when we made the decision to sign Ronaldo and didn't sign the players that we actually needed. When we were on an upwards trajectory, we finished second, all right, a distant second, but a second nonetheless. And we were qualifying for the Champions League regularly. We were looking competitive again. We were looking like we were a couple of players away from the team. So we were moving in the right direction. So it was, for the first time really in the club's history, and people can say what they want about the ownership at any period of time, but it's the first time really that the ownership had held United back, or the cost of the ownership. That even in United's most difficult times under Edwards, no one could say, well, we didn't spend and that cost us. Do you know what I mean? Whereas we couldn't, because of the cost of the debt, and it cost Ollie. And I think United is still, I'm not saying that Ollie was, I feel, as I explained in the book, I do feel that apart from the moments under Ten Hag, there are a couple of moments in there, and a couple of moments under Van Gaal, which regular listeners of this podcast will know the period of time I'm referring to. Apart from those, the most sustained period of time where it felt like we were watching a settled United side that looked like it should do was undoubtedly under Ollie. So for now, we feel as far away from that as we ever have done since Fergie left. And that's a huge nosedive in a short period of time.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, you kind of conclude the book with like pulling out these things that identify United.
Yeah.
Attacking, entertaining football, youth, courage. They've almost become mantras for the club, haven't they? Oh, I mean, literally put on the back of shirts.
Yeah.
And so on. And then you also pull out some goals that you feel like typify United's identity. Only 2 in the post-Fergie era, though. And they are against City in the cup final and Liverpool on the way.
Yeah.
On the way to that cup final.
Yeah, because I mean, and really the Liverpool one was the chaos theory, the element that, you know, like Makeda, there are moments that ties to more than the overarching philosophy of the club. So there are certainly ones in there. Yeah, I mean, part of the fun of doing the book in the end was summarising the moments which define it. I thought that was important to have in there rather than just saying these are all the sort of lineups and the tactical philosophies of the managers. This is my opinion of how it best represents United, and those are the moments that I most identify with. There are goals in there. The Makeda one is a big one that I talk about because I feel like that's so symbolic. The one that I always think is the definitive Manchester United goal is the George Best goal in the European Cup in '68. All of the romance that's attached to it. You can, like the Cobby goal in the cup final. That's why I love that goal so much. Everyone who follows me on Twitter knows I repeat it most Saturdays.
Getting sick of you posting it, yeah.
Yeah, a few people do. But I love it so much. And it's why I love Cobby so much, because of, firstly, he represents that, but secondly, the goal itself is because it's so attached to who we are. It's so part of who we are. And when you see something like that and it wins a trophy, it's like Mark Hughes scoring in 91 or the Cup Winners' Cup final, or even Lee Martin scoring. If you were there for that moment, and that's it, those moments which were the end of the old era and the start of the new under Ferguson, they have special resonance to them. And
well, there's this sort of tension between romance and results, isn't there?
Yeah.
And ideally, you have both, right? But what United fans will accept is the romance and the moments without all of the results, as long as they have that.
Yeah.
And it's where it's the crap football and the crap results that it's like really hard to, or nearly impossible to take.
Yeah.
The new man, do we see anything in this new man? Like there's people talk about the formation and how much he's wedded to the formation. He doesn't, right? He dismisses that. He talks about philosophies.
Yeah.
And ideals. And which kind of, I don't know if he's the man or not, and he's in a very difficult position. The club is overall.
Yeah.
But there's something about him feels like he wants to play the right kind of football that would fit with United, even if the 3-4-3 is not exactly. You have to go back 60 years to the last time United were regularly playing three at the back.
That's a fair point, and it is I've not really covered Amarin in the book because I don't want to.
No.
I didn't want to do that while he was happening. Actually, nice timing of the club to sack Ten Hag in terms of the book being published, because it gives it a rounded conclusion set. But the early conclusions that someone would take from reading the book and then think, how does that correlate with what we're seeing with Amarin, is that first of all, the formation change is massive. The only time that's really been done has been Van Gaal, where he's done something that was a different formation to what the common one. And the second one was, he said it earlier on in his reign, where he said he's not adaptable. I know that's a phrase that's come back out this week, where I think Paul Scholes was talking about it. I was surprised that he said that. Oh no, it's not that. I think Rennie Mullenstein on the High Performance podcast, which is really good, by the way, he's not talking to Jake. He's talking to the more tolerable gent. Anyway, he talks about the formation and the manager saying that he's not going to be adaptable, and that maybe the wrong turn of phrase because he said it too early on. And maybe we've had this conversation about Amarin and what he does within that system to make it more dynamic with the players that he's got. And he's obviously doing that. So it is interesting to see that, because the manager hasn't done that and they haven't been successful doing that. I think the biggest compliment that you can give a successful United manager over that period of time is when they've had the common formation of the day, but it's been adaptable enough to take on any kind of challenge. And that takes time. You can't just do that from day one. It does take a lot of time of getting to know your team and bringing in the players that you want and molding them to be able to cope with those different kind of challenges. And I think that's, in a large part, firstly, what inspired me to write the book anyway, because Busby and Ferguson are seen as tactical masterminds. And part of that is because they were so adaptable, so adept at coming up with a sort of answer for any challenge, that there wasn't one way to pin them down. You wouldn't say, well, that's an easily defined, in the same way that you could say that in the end against Wenger, even, and you would hold it against him. Or they would say against Guardiola for not having a plan B now. Or even like most managers now, they'll go like, oh, I've only got a plan A, and I only want a plan A. Well, the great managers, for United at least, have been the adaptable ones. And that was why, a long-winded way, made me want to go back and sort of like bring those, especially in the Busby era, where they did talk about him in the reverence in which he should be, although they talked about his genius on the occasion. Because very often in the 50s and 60s, they would be confounded by it, then saying, "Oh, what is this kind of football that Busby's playing? And is it tactically brilliant, or is it just a style?" And you know what I mean? They were even devaluing it then in a certain way. So I wanted to give that Busby and Ferguson the sort of flowers that they deserve because they are tactically brilliant managers. They were, and they did. Busby created something. Ferguson very much admitted he was following it as a custodian, but that was in a large part because they were adaptable. And Amorim, I would have to think, would have to be show signs of adaptability.
Well, time will tell on that one, will it not? All right, that's Football Talk by Matt Busby, out on the 27th of March, and you can order your copies now from the usual places. Can you get signed copies, Wayne?
Yeah, you can still do that. Just give me a message and I'll sort that out. I did have a link up for them, but I mean, now that was
all
like
right.
when most people wanted them, and now it'll be like drop feeding 1 or 2. So just message me.
All
if
right,
you want
well, slide into Wayne's DMs with your requests for a book, a signature, and a photo of Wayne. Kimono fully open. No.
Good grief, don't promise that.
Oh, dearie me, that'd be a specialist one. All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone. You can catch us on YouTube if you're listening to this. You can catch us on the podcast apps. If you're watching it, you can find us on Patreon if you want the backers shows. And you can find Wayne in all good bookstores right now.